Hey, I got a question asking me, how did I end up devoting so much of my time as an adult to the study of languages? And this is one of those questions where I would have absolutely nothing to say if I weren't going to be 100% honest with you. If I were only going to be 80% honest, this video would be completely vacuous and empty, and really nothing would be communicated. The reality is I grew up in Canada, and the Canadian education system, every part of it I have had contact with, is terrible. And that's not a tragedy in my life that took place at just one time. It's a tragedy I've had to face and deal with again and again and again. And what I've had to ask myself, in effect, every time I've encountered a sort of appalling lack of competence in the education system here, was to reevaluate from scratch, okay, who am I? What do I want to do with my life? How am I going to be an intellectual? How am I going to deal with the problems that really matter to me? And ultimately, how am I going to pay my rent and earn a living? Given that the education system is terrible, exactly where I need it to be strong, competent, to meet some minimum standard of adequacy. Now, obviously, not everyone in life has this experience. It's possible you're Canadian and you only wanted to be a dentist and you went to a dental college and worked out great for you and you had no problems in life. I'm happy for you. Whenever people offer examples to the contrary, I say I'm happy for them and that's it. I'm not making any universal claims about what's wrong with the Canadian education system. However, many people I've talked to have actually reported similar patterns of institutional failures in many other disciplines across Canada, sometimes, of course, from other departments in the same universities I'm familiar with. So culturally, it is interesting how widespread the problems I encountered are. And now, I myself have directly dealt with these problems in so many different places. But, the real answer to the question of why language became such a focus for me was, to use just one example, I had a lot of experience in a department of political science. And in that Department of Political Science, I was really horrified to find that what was going on was very similar to what I'd seen not just in the Department of Philosophy, but in the Department of Theater, related to acting and in creative fields. What was going on was that students were being evaluated on their ability to flatter the professor. Now, what I mean by flattery is a little bit complex here. It's not just showing up and telling the professor that he's handsome and smart. But the educational content of the course was really crowded out, was really reduced or even eliminated by a game being played of repeating back to the professor what he said and why it's important, and agreeing with the biases, ego trips, and fascinations of the faculty at the university. And now that wouldn't be such a problem if you were in a program where people were doing that, but they were also gaining competency in the core discipline being taught. If there's flattery going on, but people are also really learning their subject matter, that's one thing. But when that's the only thing going on and people are exiting these courses without, basic familiarity with what's being taught, that's worse. And that was, University of Toronto, overall, I really was shocked that I had to face up to the fact that although my high school education had been terrible, it was an abysmally low-quality high school education, I went to university. It was supposedly the best university in Canada, and the quality was even worse in every way, including, who the instructors were and what kind of education they had. The high school teachers at least had some education how to teach, and the people I was dealing with at the university did not. In many ways, they did not know what they were doing. And they didn't want to know. They didn't care. It wasn't their interest or concern. Now, look, why did languages emerge as the solution to this puzzle? Well, what are you going to do if you're in a situation where everything around you is basically bullshit. You're going to look for the one aspect that is evaluated in an objective way instead of in a subjective way. The one aspect of politics, for example, that is not just based on agreeing with the professor's politics. And the one thing that opens up a door to doing original research that doesn't depend on you flattering with the professor or happening to have the same opinion as the professor on politics or what have you. The one aspect that is not a game. And language and the capacity to do original translations, original analysis, already emerged there. To my eyes, it took years. I mean, nobody taught me any of this stuff. It was just seeing the failures and the dead ends and the depressing reality of what was going on in Canadian higher education. And it seemed to me that language was the one aspect here that was something tangible, useful, real, and where at the end of the day, even if the professor hates me, even if the professor disagrees with me politically, left wing versus right wing or whatever the split is, who knows, ultimately you sit down and write an exam and either your answers are right or they're wrong. And the types of games I'd seen being played around me in political science and philosophy and in numerous other departments would not be played anymore. So that's really the crucial first step. And the second one is, as I've mentioned on this channel, a lot of my own interests revolved around, at the end of my time in university, the first time back, starting in 1997, at the end of that time, I was interested in First Nations, which is our word here in Canada for Indigenous people, so-called American Indians, and I was interested in Buddhism, and I was interested in poverty, post-war destruction, post-war, post-communism, etc. And I think you may have heard me comment on this channel before that in some ways my interest in First Nations is similar to my interest in Cambodia. I'm interested in the struggle. I'm interested in the reality of who these people really are. I'm not interested in a cartoon. I'm not interested in a glorified ideal drawn from history 500 years ago. I'm not interested in any kind of hippie or new age nonsense. The Cambodia I was interested in was the real Cambodia, the post-war, mess of a country that emerged from the ashes of communism and, tried to build new huts on a basis of, scorched earth, mass graves. A country that had, yes, an ancient history of Buddhism, but, a history that had come to an abrupt crossroads in the 20th century with, the arrival of French colonialism and, unbelievable challenge posed by communism. I can remember commenting to people in First Nations, when I was studying First Nations at First Nations University in Canada. I can remember saying to people, Laos and Canada have a lot in common. Laos is a country in Southeast Asia. Laos and Canada, these were the two parts of the world where the British Empire and the French Empire, came to their natural limits and met. It's true. The border between Laos and Myanmar. There used to be British and French soldiers who would sit and play chess there where the empires met, where they were contesting the furthest limits of British and French territory at the edges of the world. And likewise, of course, the map of Canada was defined by wars between the British and the French to control territory. So just say, post-colonialism, post-communism, poverty, these things united seemingly unrelated interests. But my point here is, when you've come out of an education system that is terrible, that's lamentably awful, and you're looking at any of those fields or all of those fields, you have any of those interests or all of those interests, for me, the one aspect that stood out as something real, as something of objective value, and something where I wasn't going to be evaluated on the basis of how charming the professor thought I was, or to what extent I agreed with his opinions, politically or otherwise, that was language. It seemed to me that the challenge of language and translation that was where the bullshit stopped. And I was hoping that by really basing my engagement with Buddhism on language and the study of the ancient language Pali as well as the modern contemporary language, that I could base my study on language and politics, and that I could deal with Buddhism without getting drawn into all of the BS that Buddhism is famous for, without in any way being drawn into the quagmire of the sort of New Age hippie nonsense. And you could say the same. It was true way back then when I was first interested in First Nations, and it was true much more recently when I went to study, Cree, Ojibwe, these languages in Canada. For me, I mean, politically, one of the most important struggles is to keep those languages from going extinct. And again, the hope being, look, if I base my engagement on language, then I have a solid footing to deal with all kinds of questions of politics and what have you. And the evaluation of me and my work is not going to be based on fawning and flattery and these types of political considerations. I'm now going to tell a seemingly unrelated anecdote that may or may not illustrate this and broaden this out for some people. I think in life we go through changes where we reevaluate our understanding of what the education system is, how it works, what it's trying to teach us, who we are as people, and what we want to become. And, of course, what our career aspirations are. I had a girlfriend many, many years ago who wanted to be a painter, wanted to be a creative artist. She had the idea that she would earn a living in art restoration and would then be able to pay her rent and support herself as a painter. Her perspective on this, as she started to look into the details of what type of education she needed and what qualifications she needed, was that to her dismay, everything had to do with chemistry. She needed to go back to university and take courses in chemistry. She even needed to go back to high school and take the advanced high school classes in chemistry and then go to university and so on. And her whole way of speaking about this was to see the chemistry as an unfortunate obstacle to the job. And I talked about this with an older, experienced guy, a guy who had worked in that field for many years, worked with people in conservation and restoration, what have you. And he said one sentence to me that was so simple, and I got it. He didn't have to say anymore. On the subject of chemistry, he just said to me, "Yes, but you see, that is the job." Close quote. That was all he said. But I immediately got the point, and I went back and I did try to share it with my girlfriend. What you're thinking about as an obstacle to the job, what you're thinking about as a regrettable drawback to the job, that is the job. It's not just that it's the core of the job or an important part of the job. That is the whole job. This job is chemistry, and chemistry is this job. She thinks about it as something connected to creative art and her own, aspirations of life, but no, the actual work of being a conservation technician doing art restoration is to sit down and do chemistry every day. That is the whole job. On this channel lately, we've addressed people being frustrated with the apparent stupidity and incompetence of dietitians. People who may have 4 or 5 years in university and a long process to become a dietitian, but who still apparently don't know the basics or are wrong about unbelievable things, what have you. Well, if you actually know the education system and how it works wherever it is you live, it's not useful to just say this is all rubbish, unless you're a multimillionaire and you can set up your own educational foundation. For the vast majority of us, that can only be the first step in analysis. The first step is to say, something's wrong here. Can I understand what's wrong? Can I understand to what extent it's a problem with me? Can I understand to what extent it's a problem with the institution? And can I understand what the job is this is supposed to be preparing me for? What is the core competence this is supposed to lead to? And then can I plan my life in a way that compensates for it? Now, Chinese was not the language I wanted to learn. Not at all. Chinese was not my first choice. It was my last choice. But obviously, even the choice of learning Chinese at all reflects on my part that I'd already gone to Southeast Asia. I'd already lived on the banks of the Mekong River. I'd studied languages with no teacher and no textbook. I'd made my own textbooks using little bits and pieces of U.S. military training manuals. For languages like Cambodian, there are language materials produced by the U.S. military, and leaflets produced from United Nations refugee camps. I'm not joking. I've been through those types of materials for languages like Laotian and Cambodian. And with a language like Pali, I made my own materials, and people still download them from the internet using them to this day. So with tremendous independence, self-reliance, creativity, hard work, and no teacher and nobody to help me, I worked on all these other languages. But at the end of the day, I needed credentials. I needed an MA, possibly a PhD. I needed a career. And really the only language I could study in Canadian academia was Chinese. And I am a prisoner of my passport. I've looked into university programs over the world, but this in itself is... it's both part of the problem and part of the solution in my case. This semester, I'm broadening out a little bit to talk about advice about education and so on. This semester, I sat down and wrote an essay in one night. All the research, all the writing in one night, and I got 95%. And I believe that was the highest grade anyone got in the class on that essay assignment. I had another class where the grade is less impressive. As I recall, it was 88.5. Did all the research and all the writing in one night. And that was also the highest grade in that class. So that professor is a tough marker. Nobody else got an A+. I was the only student with an A+ on that assignment in that class. Why did I get such high grades with so little effort in those two classes? The reality is it's not my intelligence. The intelligence helps. The fundamental thing is that I was sitting in the right classroom. Finding the right institution, finding the right professor, finding the right class, that's like 90% of the grade, right? And there were other classes being taught just down the hallway that I couldn't possibly succeed in, or where I'd have to work incredibly hard to get a B-, because of the nature of what was being taught, the nature of who was teaching it, or the methodology for evaluation, for the type of participation they expect, and so on. And every semester here, this is something nobody taught me and I didn't know back in 1997. I enroll in classes and I drop classes. The choice of which classes I'm going to attempt to take, it totally determines your success or failure. Now, by that same token, so I've just given you examples of courses I've done incredibly well in. By that same token, the tragic, heartbreaking, terrible thing is when you sit down in a class and it's terrible, and you know that you should drop it, and you know that you must drop it, and you know that you can't succeed. You know that no matter how smart you are, no matter how hardworking you are, the deck is stacked against you for various reasons, for how the course is taught, or who's teaching it, or what have you. And when you know that, when it's not a suspicion, like it's not a theory, you know for a fact you cannot succeed in this class. Again, whether to some extent it's who you are, to some extent it's who the institution is, subject matter how it's being taught. That is the worst feeling in the world, especially when it's the Chinese language course and you just moved from Taiwan to Victoria specifically in order to learn Chinese. When the Chinese language class is terrible, it's an unredeemable failure, and there's nothing you can do to make it work for you. But you also can't drop it, and you don't know what to do. So that's a situation I have just come through now. And even though, I'm old and experienced, I suffered terribly from that. There's real emotional and intellectual anguish that comes out of being in that situation, even though it's a situation I've been in before. So this sense in which I've tried to describe the failure of educational institutions around me, shaping my career choices, shaping my destiny, if you like, that's not something that just happened once. It's not just that at University of Toronto, the philosophy department was garbage and the political science department was garbage and I had to try to figure out a way ahead in life. It's something I've encountered again and again and again. And, you know, I can't even list. I mean, the number of departments related to Buddhist studies that were garbage and where there was no way to succeed in it. So that's a long list. And amazingly, and now I could also give a long video talking about First Nation studies in Canada. You know, linguistics linked to First Nations, and also political science, politics is linked to First Nations. So I could speak on quite a few different subjects where I invested a lot of time and effort trying to find a path that would lead me ahead and finding nothing. So I think that covers the subject matter of this video, and it also in some ways brings you up to date with my personal life, because so far as I know, in the next few months I am moving to China, and I'm going to be living in China in order to learn Chinese.